and set it as the active speaker will be shown on the screen. Okay, I'm going to keep going here. Oops. Our guiding question, Armand.
Yep. So the guiding question we're going to be returning to throughout the session is, what decisions am I making for students now that students could be making for themselves to demonstrate their learning? So we're making that reflective process, thinking about the things we already do to assess our students, and thinking about places where we can start empowering them to make those decisions for themselves. Good. So our outcomes for today, we're going to reflect on how we already incorporate choice and voice in our class. We're all coming in from different places, even as you saw in that opening poll. Maybe you've been playing with this a bit. Maybe you feel like you've had to do all of it. You're carrying all that weight yourself, right? So we want to reflect on what we're already currently doing. And then we also want to learn how to incorporate some student choice and voice in assessments that could be very entry level. And we'll see some options later on about where we can do some entry level choice and voice. But maybe you've already been doing it, you want to expand upon that. And then we're going to finish this session with some ideas to incorporate. Throughout, there's going to be a couple breakout sessions where you get to put your ideas up there. And we've seen from the last few sessions that teachers are already coming in with awesome ideas, whether they've already tried them or they're just thinking about trying them. So throughout the session, we'll get some ideas that you can put into your class. So the big why here, ultimately our view is that if students are given some choice and voice, they begin to own their learning. We want them to be empowered to essentially own their learning and not feel like it's being done to them. And so we want to make them as part of the process as we can. We want to onboard them in that process. Okay, so I want you to reflect on time as a student. This is a time where you could actually blow up the chat a little bit. I want you to think of a time, either in K-12 or even in college, share a time when you feel like you were given a choice and it motivated you, and or it just felt like your voice mattered when it was within your education. As you're kind of reflecting and thinking about that, I could share one experience of mine that stood out. This was when I was in college. It was one of my first upper division math classes. Really enjoyed the class. It was a lot of discussion. I got to volunteer a lot and share with the whole class, be a spokesperson for my group. But when it came to the test, I'm kind of a slow thinker. There was a lot of communication needed to happen. And I felt like I was doing well on the test. And then before I knew it, my time just like passed and I only finished about half of it. And so I was really worried that that was going to impact my grade. But after talking to the professor, he assured me that my grade was going to be fine. And what that really communicated to me was that I had other ways to show my mastery skills or to show my value in the class. My teacher recognized that too, so he was willing to work with me on that. And I felt really comfortable that it wasn't going to be dependent upon all on a midterm or a final, that just what I brought to class every day was good enough. And so that like stood out to me, and I think I carried that with me all the way into my time as an educator now. So yeah, I encourage you to keep putting into the chat and then taking some moments to read what's going on in there too. There are some highlights of like when a teacher did it, but what I often find is that that's not the norm. It's just like this experience, right? Maybe in one class for a couple, maybe just like this one moment, right? So we want to make that shift. How do we get students to kind of own their learning? How do we create these opportunities so that, 10 years or 15 years down the road, our students are going to be in a PD session like this one, and they're going to be able to fill it up with all sorts of experiences, right? Because we gave that to them. You go next slide. So the big why here, I think we want to make a shift really. The education that we experienced was really compliance-based. The teacher set up some things for me to do, and my success in that class is really dependent upon my ability to follow directions, to comply to my teacher and just do what was asked of me. And in my case, like inability to comply was also going to impact that as well. And that was very true in many of my classes. And so we really want to make the shift to move from compliance. Like, I don't want my students just doing what I'm telling them to do just because I told them to do it. I want them engaged in the process. I want to onboard them. And then ultimately, I want to empower them. I want them to feel like they have ownership over what's happening in their class and their success. And as Ruben's going to talk about later, assessment in life is closer to this engagement empowerment feeling. When we assess ourselves naturally in life, we're not really thinking often about complying to someone or something. It's usually internal, and so we want to kind of get closer to that. So let's talk a little bit about the what of assessment. All right, so assessment, one way we can break it down is think about formative and summative assessments. Formative assessments are kind of what they sound like. You're forming student learning at this time. You're monitoring the student learning, you're providing feedback, you're making adjustments in instruction, delivering instruction. It's not just about the student forming, it's also about the teacher too. It's for student reflection and teacher reflections. It's not necessarily always for a grade. Could be used as something like participation, but this is like in the formative stage of the knowledge. Could be the beginning of the introduction of a skill, or still like in the middle of the process for that, or even maybe just like a project launch too. Summative is a little closer to like towards the end of skill development. It could include things like end of unit assessments or projects. It could be closer aligned to standards for your class. It's clearly measurable with some kind of rubric criteria. It has some form of transferable skill, something that students can apply to a new learning context. And I think often the line between formative and summative could be very thin. And it's hard to know, is like the thing I'm giving right now going to be a formative or summative assessment? What I would encourage us to think about is less about applying this idea to the entire class and really thinking more on a student by student basis. For some students, an assessment can be summative, and that can happen really early on if a student already knows what's happening, right? But if a student is still developing that skill, then it's going to be formative for them, even if you intended it to be summative. So I think students kind of determine this because we're going to work with where they are and where their skill levels are. And we'll see some examples of what that can look like in a bit. Ruben, you're muted.
We have assessment in school and we have assessment in life. And so we don't often think about all the assessment that's happening when we're just interacting beyond our school time, whether that's as students or as teachers. And so we want to kind of bring this up and you know, start thinking about the fact that we're constantly receiving feedback, we're constantly assessing our situation when we're in life, and just kind of like looking through the pictures, thinking about, you know, kids or ourselves doing some form of cooking. That's constantly, we're constantly tasting. We're trying to figure out if it tastes right, if we've got the right ingredients, do we need to add more? That's a constant level of feedback and assessment that's happening. In playing basketball, when Armand and I were putting this together, I play a lot of basketball just in my front yard, just out of my hoop. And every day I'm trying to figure out how to make as many baskets as I can. And some days I'm knocking them down, and other days I'm not. And just small adjustments. I have to make these small adjustments. I hadn't even really thought about it, but I've been doing that my whole life without really knowing. My stepdad taught me how to shoot a ball, and he helped me out. But ever since then, it's kind of been my own tweaking, my own feedback. When the ball doesn't go in the hoop, or doesn't go in the right direction, or doesn't go far enough, what do I need to do? Kids playing games. Many of you have probably seen this in school because they're trying to escape maybe what they're supposed to be doing in school, and they're trying to play games. Or at home, instead of doing their homework or going outside and playing, they're in games, and people don't understand why, because it's super engaging. There's automatic feedback that's coming back to them, and they're playing collaboratively with their friends and trying to figure things out. It's designed to, you know, engage them, and it's designed for them to use design thinking and figure things out. Building Legos. I mean, it's the classic. If you go into a kindergarten classroom, first grade classroom, and you see students, you know, building something, they're always building, tearing down, trying to get it right. Driving. We've all probably experienced this. Maybe we have some people out there who've never driven a car, but you've at least driven in a car, and just this whole experience of learning to drive. And it's a dangerous game, right? I have a 16-year-old, and the first time we went out driving, it was like, oh my God, she's almost hitting every car down the road. And she's gotten, you know, just in a year, improved significantly. Every time she goes out, she's thinking about her driving skills. And then the classic one of the past number of years here, with the addition of everyone having a phone, is the selfie, right? And how many times are people, you know, is it one shot? Is it 5 shots? Is it 15 shots to get the right selfie to post on social media? I mean, this is happening, and you probably have all seen this, either with your students or out and about, and maybe you do it too, trying to get that correct and that perfect selfie to post. So it's automatic feedback. You look at the picture. Is it the one you wanted? Do I look good? Do I have, am I smiling? Am I, crooked face, or whatever it might be? And you have that automatic feedback. So this is assessment in life. We're constantly doing it subconsciously. We're not, it's not overt necessarily, but we are constantly self-assessing. And what we want you to think about is, this is something we're choosing to do. This is where we're trying to improve. But when we look at assessment in school, it's a little bit different. It's often extrinsic. It's following the system that the teacher set up. It's dependent upon the teacher. It's in some cases boring and irrelevant to the students, and there's often no choice. And as we looked in the chat and looking through some of our school experiences, it was tough to find assessment that was more like a life, where it was intrinsic. It was design. We were designing the system. We were working with the teacher or other students. We were having fun. It was relevant. It was our choice. And so what we want you to think about is this question, more like life. How might we make assessment in school more like assessment in life? And what we have 4 documents here, and we're going to pop those in the chat. Armand's done that already. Based on your last name initial, we'd love for you to jump in and grab a row in one of those documents. So I'm Hoffman. I would go on the doc that is F through K, and I would click in there and I'd find a row and I'd punch in some ideas that I have of how to make assessment in school more like assessment in life. So we'll take about 3 minutes to do this. All right, we're gonna keep going here. So again, just getting us into that mindset of really thinking about how to make assessment in school more like assessment in life. That's where we want to go, is really to go from compliance to empowerment. So when we look at the impact of choice and voice, we do have some things that are happening around that in our schools. And just kind of defining this, like the what of this is, number one, choice is, in all of you, as we're looking through these documents, you get it, like providing students with options. It's the base. It's like, it's just as simple as that. But when we get into voice, it's a little bit different in that when we're providing students with choice in how they demonstrate their learning, that's voice, how they demonstrate their learning. Okay, so those are the key words in there. Not just some choices, but how they demonstrate their learning when we talk about assessment. Voice is self-assessment and reflection. Being able to really go through and understand and self-assess and understand where they are academically, how they're doing with that standard, how they're doing with that skill, and then constant reflection around those practices. Revision and extension. So are we providing options for students to revise, modify, edit their work that they've turned in? Okay, and that could be based on your feedback or other students' feedback or their own feedback. Do they have that time and that option built in to revise? And then beyond that, they've mastered something. Are they able to extend and transfer that knowledge into and practice it more in some way? And then the last one is really providing voice in the idea of audience. How often are your students having an audience beyond the teacher to share their learning with? So those are our kind of what's around choice and voice. The impact is, well, in San Diego Unified, our mission statement is truly to graduate students with skills, motivation, curiosity, and resilience to succeed in their choice of college and career in order to lead and participate in the society tomorrow. Our mission statement of San Diego Unified strictly, it definitely says in here the words choice. So we're trying to build them into people that can make a choice. And I love the lead and participate. To me, that says voice. If we're not building them with skills and the ability to lead and participate in society tomorrow, that means we're not helping them build that voice that they could have. So that's our San Diego Unified mission statement, which some of us maybe have seen once or maybe not at all, because our schools have mission statements too. But this is an overall goal of the San Diego Unified. A couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, San Diego Unified was able to bring together some of our partners, our San Diego Unified partners, around business, philanthropic groups, nonprofits, higher education, and got them together and really talked about what are the skills we're looking for? What are these essential skills that as students move into college or career and beyond high school, what are the essential skills we're looking for in the world today, the workforce of tomorrow? And these are the ones that they came up with, not the habits of mind, but this is really the essential skills. So critical thinking, analytic reasoning. And so what we want you to think about is when we're teaching in our classrooms, and all of you know this, it's not just a focus on content, it's a focus on skills. So we want you to think about this question, and we're not asking you to respond. This is really to come back to later. How does providing choice and voice in assessments provide opportunities to develop the skills listed? So when, again, in San Diego Unified, in San Diego, this is what industry is looking for. This is what people that are hiring people are looking for. And so how does providing choice and voice help students build these type of skills? And then the research. John Hattie, maybe some of you guys have heard of him before, or maybe you've seen this work, but you don't connect the name. It's Visible Learning is his website, and his research is under Visible Learning. There's a link down at the bottom of this slide. And there's also a nice chart that we've linked to. In the research, I was trying to go through this and try to thinking about this idea of choice and voice and how it fits into the research that he's done. And really the focus of his work is how do we get the most bang for our buck when we talk about student learning and student outcomes, and how can we move them forward at a faster pace? And so I started looking over this, and I said, well, let me look at the negative effects first. And so surface motivation, approach, anxiety, boredom, those all spoke to me of no voice, no choice, no choice, no voice, however you want to say it. Those were negative, and those are going to negatively impact student learning. But on the other side, highly effective strategies, and we're going to get your bang for your buck, is on the right hand side with the highly effective attitude to content domains. So if they have choice and voice, they're probably going to have a positive attitude. Perceived task value, when they're owning their learning, the perceived task value is going to go up. Okay, concentration, persistence, engagement, those are all going to go up with choice and voice. Deep motivation and approach, same thing. Self-efficacy, their confidence in their learning is going to increase when they have choice and voice. And then the last one on here is self-reported grades. It's actually the second highest influencer of an impact on student learning. If we are able to teach our students to self-assess and reflect and be able to understand the grades that they're getting, then the impact on their success in school is going to greatly increase. So these are all things, again, this is all the research that Hattie's done, and it's amazing to me that this really speaks to choice and voice.
And so just kind of building on what Ruben's saying, I think our society really expects that our students can own the process, be independent learners, and think for themselves. We need students to understand the systems, understand the process, so that they know that their voice actually matters and has a say in it, as opposed to just thinking that teachers and educators are the ones that determine these things for them. Right now, we are in a pandemic. We're in the midst of the civil rights movement. American society expects that students or young people can have a voice and understand that their voice matters. And they can't start figuring that out when they're adults. They need to start figuring that out when they're much younger. And we can teach them to do that. And, just from the experiences of people putting into the chat, it looks like we didn't always have a lot of voice and choice in our education, but I know we had voice and choice outside of it in life, right? And what we really want to do is make this push so that our education mirrors our lives in more meaningful ways. And we can do that by giving students more ownership about what's happening in the education process. So again, we need to make that shift, right? We need to move away from compliance, from students just following directions, to getting engaged in this process, doing things that they're interested in, and empowering them. And I know in a few of the other sessions we talked about, some people mentioned sometimes you do need to teach the kid a skill, right? A skill they might not be as interested in, but that doesn't mean we still can't engage them and empower them in that process. Doesn't mean that they just do independent projects all the time. They still have skills to learn, but we can still onboard them in how they're assessed, and make sure they have ownership and know that they're doing something because they want to get better at it, not because their teacher asked them to.
So when we look at choice, and we're going to get into like kind of the how a little bit, we really want to come back to the guiding question. What decisions am I making for students that they could be making for themselves to demonstrate their learning? We want to keep coming back to this, and this is kind of a question we would love for you to take away and ask yourself as you start to plan lessons, units throughout the year. With this, I think this is a great quote that Christine Dixon, she's from San Marcos District. I grabbed this from her. If students all learn differently, shouldn't we give them a choice in how they represent this learning? And really thinking about, again, going back to choice is one thing, but making them have or giving them the option to represent the learning or demonstrate the learning. And that's where the voice comes in. So when we start thinking about choice, and I saw some people put in like, like a choice boards or learning menus. A lot of people are rushing off to the internet, and they're finding these awesome choice boards or learning menus or tic-tac-toe boards or whatever you want to call them. What we want you to do is step back a little bit before you start rushing off and grabbing things and building out these choice options, and really thinking about, what is it that I'm doing? What kind of choice am I giving here? So these are all clickable links. You can go back and look at them later, but these are out there. And to me, like when I look at this, it's pretty overwhelming. So we probably have to walk students through this, but we want to start, before we start grabbing choice menus and learning menus, we want to really think about the levels of choice. And number one, what am I comfortable with? Okay. And what works for my students? So we want to, again, going back to this idea, going from mostly teacher directed to entirely student directed. Those are the different levels of choice. And we want you to understand what those levels are and how you're using choice as you're providing that with your students. So the first one is embedded choice. It's really, we've all done this, and we've all probably experienced this at some point. It's a common assignment with one element of choice. And that choice could be in presentation style, or maybe it's a web tool that I'm using. It could be the topics that I have to select from. Here's a list of topics, choose one. Or it could be a menu of questions or problems that I'm selecting from. What's cool about the example here is that San Diego Union Tribune and San Diego County Office of Ed created one of these kind of embedded choice options in the spring for parents to use. So really it was all a common assignment, but at different points, students are kind of selecting what they get to do within that common assignment. So this is the, again, example of embedded choice. It's real simple. One element of choice provided. A simple choice menu is more like this tic-tac-toe board that's on the screen right now. So you have a common learning target with choice in learning path and demonstration of learning. So we're all going to learn this skill or this standard, okay? But how you get there is kind of being determined by you. So you're giving them some choice in groups, topics, products that they create, okay? So this tic-tac-toe board, again, there's a couple links down here. This is where it's great to go back through the slide deck and get some examples and see that. But in this case, in the tic-tac-toe, in the middle, it says write one paragraph summary of your novel and share on a slide in our collaborative slide deck. Everyone's going to do that. Okay, that's going to be your final outcome that you do, but you're also going to be doing these things around there, and you get to choose what those might be. Advanced choice menu is more getting into self-selecting a learning target. So a student is, wanting to focus more on this skill or this standard and improve in that area. So in this case, there's kind of like this idea, they choose a learning target or targets, okay, that they haven't mastered. They then pick the resources that they'll use to learn about it, and then they're going to choose the product that they're going to, that's going to show off their mastery of the content. So in this, they might choose their groups, they might choose different learning targets, the resources and research that they use, and the presentation. This could also be crowdsourced. Students could be working together on something like this together and crowdsourcing maybe the resources or types of products, and then they get to choose even further from there. So this is the advanced choice menu. And then there's the full independent project, where it's a shift from choice to freedom. And really, students are deciding on their own where they're going to go. So it's choice in groups, topics, questions. And maybe this is like, hey, between these 2 units, let's try this on. For this week, we're going to try this independent project. Here are, here's some options, or you can, you have the option to choose your own. Down on the bottom there's some great examples. We have all these challenges that were created over the summer for students to take on. Offline choice boards, Genius Hour, maybe you heard 20% time or Genius Hour, where students get to choose. And then Packful is the Jacobs Institute at USD has created a design thinking application where students use the global goals, and they select a global goal, and they use design thinking process to try to solve or come up with a solution in our world today. So these are the types of independent type of projects that we're talking about. Okay, so levels of choice. What we want to do is give you some time now to really think about this from your perspective. And what you're going to do is, it says individually first, and then we're going to get into some groups. So individually, you're going to make a copy of, and you're going to click on that link. We'll also put that in the chat. I think Armand has already done that. So make a copy of the levels of student choice. And then you're going to brainstorm ideas for incorporating choice at each of the different levels. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm making a copy of this, and I'm going to be thinking about where in my curriculum, what are some ideas for incorporating choice when it comes to embedded choice. And then I'm going to scroll down and think about some ways I can embed or use a simple choice menu of some sort. So where might there be opportunities to do this in my curriculum this next month, this quarter, this semester, this year, and punch those in. We're going to play some music. We'll take about 5 minutes to do this. And then we're going to get into some breakout rooms and share some ideas. Okay, it looks like we pretty much have everyone back with us. Again, we have a great collection of resources here of teacher ideas. So we're going to send this out via email so that everybody has access to this. This could also be a great activity to kind of go through with the people that you collaborate with regularly at your school, maybe across schools if you're working with other individuals, through a department, and just start thinking about this idea of choice. Like, what type of choice are we giving? What level of choice? And usually we're going to probably be in that embedded and the embedded and simple choice menu section, but sometimes we're going to get into that advanced choice menu or independent projects. So again, great activity to do with others and also by yourself, but looking back through some other people's ideas would be good too. All right, we're going to continue moving through.
All right, so as we think about incorporating voice as well, we're going to return to that guiding question. What decisions am I currently making for students that students could be making for themselves to demonstrate their learning? And as we see that document get populated, like we said, we're going to share everything back out with you. We can see there's already some ideas kind of churning in there. We want to continue to build on those, add on to them. Also show us a few examples as well. All right, so it's clear assessment is only authentic when the students own the process. As I think back on my education, or even just some of the jobs I've had, when it's inauthentic, I don't own any of the process. I'm not part of it anyway. It's kind of being done to me. Think of a job that you didn't really like, or a boss that you didn't really have a good relationship with. Where it can be very authentic if you own the process. And for myself, I think about something like golfing. I like to golf. I own the process. I understand how assessment works. I understand the system. When I strike the ball, I get a lot of feedback immediately, whether it be good or bad. And I am authentically trying to improve myself because I'm part of this process, right? So I own this process. We want to think about how we get students to own the process as well. All right, so how do we get students to own this process and develop their ownership of it? We want to really onboard them into places that we have been assessing them, but we want to kind of teach them how to do it themselves. Things that we normally do, we want to find out what they already know, so their prior knowledge, what they don't know, what they want to master, and what they're going to do to improve. We can teach students how to be part of this process as well, so it's not just us doing it to them, but they're also doing it for themselves. All right. So when we're providing choice and assessment, how are we going to support students? We need to get learning goals and rubrics very clear for students. They need to understand the system as well as we do. Oftentimes, educators are the only ones that really understand their grading systems well, and students kind of just like wait to see what happens when the teacher gives them the grade. But imagine if they understood that system as well as you do. We can do that if we make learning goals and rubrics really clear for students so that they can assess themselves. We need students to have some form of choice, and we saw a few examples of what that choice looks like, right? Whether it's in simple embedded choice all the way from independent projects. And just because we're giving students more ownership over these pieces doesn't mean the teacher's not still incredibly active. You're still leading instruction, you're still providing learning guides and resources, you're still checking progress, you're still providing feedback, you're determining instructional needs. We're just including students more in this process than maybe we might have experienced before. And again, going back to the research, the effect size of the self-assessment reflection to self-reported grades, second highest impact on student achievement. I used to do grade negotiations, and the first time I did them, I was so worried that students were just going to give themselves A's. But the reality is, my experience was that oftentimes students always under-evaluated themselves. They usually reported their grade to be lower than even what I thought. There was only like a few rare cases where students reported higher, and I could probably count them on one hand over my 8 years of teaching. So self-reported, that self-assessment reflection can be super valuable for students. Yes, okay. And then we need to essentially teach these systems for self-assessment so students understand the why and the how of creating goals, of using rubrics and checklists, of just self-reflecting properly and effectively, tracking data, both qualitative and quantitative. And the way we can teach students is we need to just provide time and space for students to develop these things. We need time in class for them to review these goals and rubrics and checklists so we can still support them in how to do this. We can give reflections and polls and surveys. We can do conferencing with them right during office hours. So if we make space for these important skills, they'll develop over time. And imagine if elementary teachers start with this and then we build it up all the way through high school. Students can be very good at self-assessing and reflecting by the time they leave us. Okay, so I want to show an example of what a rubric could look like. So this is a rubric for assessing your basketball skills. It's broken down in a few different categories. I want you to take a moment to just read through it. 1 being on the lower end, 4 being on the higher end. And then you can pop some ideas into the chat here. In what ways would a rubric like this support students with self-assessment and reflection? All right, and so again, this is not a perfect rubric by any means, right? It's just a starting point, but it does provide some features. It breaks down basketball into 3 different categories, and you could probably break it into more. Think about a starting basketball player versus like a professional one, right? That rubric's going to look pretty different. But the idea is we're not just labeling as good or bad basketball player. We can have students assess themselves in different areas of the game so that they might be good dribblers, but maybe they still need to work on their shooting. So it's not just a singular label. It's really more of a spectrum, right? When we're in a spectrum, this is closer to what life skills feel like, is that we don't just label into the good or bad. We all land somewhere in it, and then we have goals about how to move forward in it. So again, revision is another big part of the process when we're thinking about assessment. If the goal for our students is to achieve mastery in whatever we're teaching them, then when students are not showing proficiency on a topic, where is the room for choice and voice in the way they're reassessed? So how might I provide students with these opportunities to revise, to get peer feedback and support, to get more instruction from the teacher, maybe get new alternative assessment opportunities, and a big one, time to work towards mastery if they're not showing it initially. Any skill we're trying to teach students, there's going to be a percentage that demonstrates the mastery, and there'll be a percentage that doesn't. And so we need like plans. How do we react to that? How do we get students in that process as well? All right, so this is what a traditional assessment path might look like, or the one I think I experienced a lot of when I was in school, is you get some form of assessment. It could be a variety of things. It could be a warm-up, could be a homework assignment, could be a quiz or test, and then something happens, right? Either we do really well on it, we demonstrate mastery, cool, we get like our A, right? Or maybe we're approaching, and it's always been interesting to think about like where that lands for a grade, because it could be anywhere from a B to a D. And then it's like you show little or nothing, and then you're in that F range, right? There's not a lot of room for choice and voice in here. The only thing that happens is a grade. It can feel very punitive. And this is where that compliance-based kind of assessment is happening. Yeah, next one. All right. And this is what a voice assessment path could look like. Um, Certainly not perfect, but it does provide some other opportunities. And so if a student is demonstrating mastery, what can happen next? They may not need to be reassessed. Maybe they should just get a choice of an extension activity or an independent learning assignment. Or maybe they could just support others in their reassessment and build that community of learners to kind of let students know we're all in this together. If you're approaching or not showing or showing little understanding or just didn't answer it, right, then they need a chance to revise, right? They need a chance to revise either by themselves, maybe with just some small errors that they could fix themselves, or maybe they could do it with peers. Or maybe they can do it directly with the teacher. So you can think about, breakout rooms in a Zoom session, or just using Zoom office hours that have been carved into a lot of schedules now. And then they need a chance to try again. It could be a new problem. I was a math teacher, so I think about problem, but it could be a lot of things. It could be a project. It could be a presentation. It could be lots of different pieces. And then how are they going to try that new standard again? They can do it maybe in a whole or small group discussion, right? They can do it around with other people. Maybe that would make sense. Or maybe it's just going back to the teacher with office hours. Or maybe they are more independent learners. So even in a math class, maybe this is where you would leverage something like a Khan Academy or some other math software, right? Maybe that's all they need if it's just a skill. So it really depends. There's room for some flexibility there, right? And so as you kind of look at this, I want to see if we could take a minute and think about in what ways does this kind of assessment path allow for choice and voice in assessment. I'm going to type that question to the chat as well. Okay, so in what ways would an assessment path like this one allow for student choice and voice in their assessments? Right, so let's take like a minute and populate the chat with whatever you're thinking. And again, similarly, if you think there's ways to improve or change this, throw those in the chat as well. See some things coming in, allows for adjustments along the way, most definitely. A lot of different checkpoints here, places to give feedback. See learning as a process, not just winning or losing, most definitely, right? That's where the grade kind of comes in, right? The traditional path is like, I did well, I'm a good student, or I didn't do well and I must be a bad student. Yep, if you show mastery initially, right, you get a chance to do something extension, some form of extension. Yeah, I've heard this in the previous sessions too, just providing support without leaving students behind. Yeah, a chance to work with peers, right, could be a really big factor. Some students just work better with their peers than they do with adults, which is fair. And definitely that extension piece. I think about that piece a lot because sometimes a student shows mastery in the warm up when you're just introducing a skill and you're like, oh, all right, like I think you're good, right? Like maybe we need to find something different for you. Aiming to meet students where they are. Yeah, like 10 seconds there. Yeah, you get a small group of students with the same goal working together. So again, this assessment path is imperfect, right? Everything we develop right now is going to be imperfect, especially in the online setting. But even as we just think about how to onboard students into the process, because it's probably not something we experience much of ourselves. But I still encourage us to try things. This type of path is like a more in-depth version of this that was part of my master's work. And when I was implementing for students, I was on iteration like 6 or 7 before I was getting into a comfortable space, right? How do I deal with like the logistics of it? How do I keep track of all my students? How do I think about grades in the whole process? So everything was just a learning experiment, but I worked a lot with my colleagues developing it. And I know that a lot of teachers do things similarly like this, right? And there could be a whole other string of like new menu options to come out to the end of this one too, right? So there's obviously lots of ways to improve on it, but just want to show an example of what it could look like to get students involved in the process of being assessed.
We want to make sure too that we know how difficult this is to implement. What all of us have learned is when we put a little time into something, though, that the students and we do that up front, and we build these skills and this ability for students to be able to do things, that in the end it saves us a lot of time. And students aren't used to doing this, so it does take time and teaching to get them to a place where they're comfortable. They're comfortable, not just us, but they're comfortable with the system too. So kind of going beyond just the normal assessment path and even into that, revision process, you get a little bit further in leveling into the voice, which is an extension piece. So we often are focused on the students who aren't performing well. But what about those students who are performing well? And Adrian kind of pointed out in the chat, just the idea of giving those students also some ways to continue the learning. And that might be through chances to support peers in their learning. It might be through teacher providing independent learning options for those students. So here's some extension activities to do. Or it might be maybe even developing like an option and system to propose independent projects and bring those to you. That's also a great skill, right? Just presenting an idea to the teacher and seeing if they'll let the student run with it. Beyond extension is just this idea of how often and where do we provide audience for our students. And this is a super important piece of voice in assessment. When they're not doing the work for you, the teacher, or the other students in the class, but they're doing it beyond that. They're doing it for their families. They're doing it for community partners, community volunteers that are coming into the school. They're doing it beyond the classroom. And so there's various options for providing student voice that kind of levels up their engagement, number one, and empowerment to use their voice. And it all falls into the assessment piece. So student-led conferences, presentations of learning, and exhibitions. So student-led conferences is kind of really the flip on the parent-teacher conferences and letting the students be in charge of that discussion, letting them collect the evidence, letting them do the reflection piece, letting them present to their families and the teacher how they think they're doing in school. It's a pretty amazing process if you haven't seen it and seen kids in action with this, but doing it once, twice, 3 times, they really own their learning, number one, and their conferences. Pretty amazing. There's a couple different links in here. Again, the slide deck has a wealth of other resources than just Armand and I talking. So please come back through these. Presentations of learning, really thinking about at the end of maybe a unit or a semester or a quarter, whatever it might be, are there opportunities for students to share their learning and present to an audience? Maybe it's of their peers, maybe it's other adults in the community, but sharing that learning and having an audience and knowing that they're going to be accountable for that really is going to bump up the level of voice. And then the last one is exhibitions, and this is just the idea of showcasing their work. This is, I can't say how empowering this is for students, say how much it is, because I've seen my own kids go through this process and I've seen other students, and it's just amazing to me how into their learning they get when they know that they're going to have an audience for their work and be able to showcase their work. This isn't actually an assessment piece. The assessment usually goes before this. They're doing all their self-reflecting and assessing their learning before they actually get to present a final product of some sort. But this is a real true celebration, and it makes school meaningful to students. So check out the different links that are in here. And then the last thing we really want to talk about around voice and assessment is just the opportunities for students to speak to what is working and what isn't working for them. And this is not, when we say like an opportunity to provide the teacher feedback, we're not necessarily saying this is an evaluation of the teacher, but it kind of is in a way. I know when I would give my students reflections and surveys and ask them questions, what I would get in return was, and what I was seeking was improvement of myself so I can help improve their learning situation. So it might be an individual student, it might be a group of students, it might be a whole class, depending on if it was a big project we were looking at or a single lesson where I was like, that didn't go so great. They didn't perform the way I thought they were going to. So just asking those informal questions and discussions and having those discussions, giving them reflections and polls and surveys, it really means a lot to students if they feel like you're taking what their opinions are and implementing them into the class. And then again, we have a lot of opportunities for office hours and small conferences with students and asking them questions, getting their feedback. They feel like they're part of the class and are truly owning their learning and the class. They're a collaborator in the class if you're providing them these opportunities. So again, help students to kind of share with you what's working and what is not working. So what we want you to do at this point is think about the path to voice. Like ideas, again, we looked at choice. Now let's look at voice. Ideas for incorporating voice into your curriculum, into your class. And I'm going to bump out of here real quick and go over to this levels of choice. Oops, the student voice and choice document that you were working on earlier. So you're working through the choice piece. But beyond that section at the bottom, there's another section for path to voice. So kind of going through these different components of voice and assessments, and just jot in some of your ideas for incorporating more voice or some voice, or however that's going to look in your classroom, and kind of going through these categories of, well, where could I incorporate more self-assessment and reflection? How could I incorporate some opportunities for revision? And we'll take about 4 minutes to work through that and pop some ideas onto here. Okay, as you're kind of wrapping up, and again, this is not, we're not expecting this document to be completed today, or it's not going to be turned in. This is really for you to go back to and use and build off of later. But at the bottom of that document you've been working on, the question is, what is one voice in assessments idea that you are committing to incorporate? We really want you to make some kind of commitment before you leave this session today around providing voice and assessment. So what's your like one? Again, we could do a million things, but we really want to focus on one thing at a time and perfecting and doing that well, whether it's choice, voice, both. But what's one voice assessment idea you're committing to incorporate? And we'd like you to take that and put it on your document, and then you can copy and paste it into the chat. Okay, we're going to finish out now because we're a little bit beyond time.
Yeah, so I'll be very brief here, and then we just hopefully can get you to fill out a quick feedback survey at the end. So again, that guiding question, what decisions are you currently making for students that they could be making for themselves? Hopefully we kind of built up some ideas around how we can do that, or maybe extend past what we've been doing in our classes recently. And again, where our comfort level is, right? You might have been very comfortable putting choice and voice, or maybe you're just starting to. So one advice that an educator gave me is to find your comfort zone and then go just outside of it. And that could help us push us and try new things to get students in the process of assessing themselves. At the end of the slideshow, you'll see some different resources. This is just some rubric makers if you want to start making rubrics, different resources around making goals, Stanford Performance Assessment Bank, just a wealth of resources to try. So you can check those out on your time. And then I'm going to go ahead and just drop this into the chat as a feedback survey. Oh, the link.
And we'll also put that in an email.
Yeah, so if you can fill that out when you get a chance, it's only like 3 questions. It'd be super, super helpful for us. And again, if you have any questions about any of these things, you can email either of us, and we're happy to respond.
And thank you everyone for coming. We know that everyone's super busy right now, and we appreciate you taking the time to be with us and think through and provide choice and voice in assessments for your students. So have a great day, and we will again be sending out an email. Thank you.